Dubai International Airport, Terminal 3, early 16 February 2026. According to accounts later described by sources familiar with the situation, the moment that reshaped the trajectory of Meghan Markle's international standing unfolded quietly at an immigration counter behind glass. She arrived in Dubai, believing the city could offer a reset. The intent, as described by observers close to the planning of the trip, was not spectacle but insulation, a jurisdiction known for discretion, luxury, and tightly managed image control. Dubai, in this view, was not a stage but a shield. At approximately 9:40 local time, her passport was scanned at immigration. The interaction reportedly paused longer than usual. A system screen flickered. No explanation was given. A subtle gesture followed, directing her away from the public queue and into a private processing area reserved for administrative review. There was no argument, no negotiation, no visible confusion. Phones were not permitted. No official explanation was offered. Those present later described the atmosphere as clinical rather than dramatic, a procedural silence that suggested the decision had been made well before the aircraft landed. What followed was not a delay, but a denial. By 10:15, the determination was reportedly final. Entry was not postponed or conditionally deferred. It was declined outright. No written statement was issued to the press. No spokesperson appeared. There was no public confrontation to document, no footage to circulate, no narrative to challenge. Witnesses later claimed that when Meghan Markle exited the private area, her demeanor appeared controlled, but visibly tense, not shocked, not confused, but angry. She departed without comment. Within hours, she was no longer in Dubai. Dubai's governance model is not known for impulsive action. It is structured around risk assessment, long-term stability, and reputational containment. Immigration decisions at this level are rarely personal. They are systemic. The city does not argue with high-profile individuals, and it does not explain itself to outsiders. According to analysts familiar with regional decision-making norms, Dubai operates on a principle that differs sharply from Western celebrity culture. Visibility is not leverage. Apologies are not currency. What matters is predictability. In this framework, the core question is never moral judgment. It is operational. Does this individual introduce volatility? This was not triggered by a single headline or global media turbulence. Conflicting public narratives, legal noise, staff disputes, financial uncertainty, and reputational friction across multiple jurisdictions had already formed a pattern. Dubai did not need to verify every claim. It did not need proof beyond reasonable doubt. It needed only to determine whether granting access created downstream risk, media disruption, diplomatic discomfort, or forced explanations it prefers to avoid. In that calculation, silence is strategy. Unlike Western systems that often allow controversy to play out publicly, Dubai neutralizes uncertainty by removing it. The denial did not humiliate, it did not accuse, it simply closed a door that, according to several observers, had never truly been open. This is why the incident resonated beyond the airport. The lack of spectacle eliminated narrative control. There was no confrontation to reinterpret, no statement to rebut, no apology tour to deploy. Administrative decisions are the hardest to reverse because they do not respond to pressure. Within global power networks, reputation does not travel through social media. It moves through private channels, advisors, former colleagues, diplomatic assessments, risk briefings. By the time a passport reaches a scanner, that evaluation has often already occurred. Dubai's decision raised an uncomfortable question among observers. If one of the world's most tightly controlled environments reached this conclusion quietly, how many others had already reached similar assessments without acting publicly? This was not framed internally as rejection of a person, but of a risk profile, one defined by unpredictability, reputational turbulence, and the need for constant narrative management. In systems built on order, that requirement alone is disqualifying. The denial marked more than a failed entry. It functioned as a signal not loud, not declarative, but definitive. And in environments where silence replaces explanation, the implications tend to extend far beyond a single border. At the center of the unfolding controversy lies a period long treated as settled history. Meghan Markle's years in Canada between 2012 and 2015. For over a decade, this chapter had been framed publicly as a professional ascent to Toronto, as the backdrop to her role on Suits, a stepping stone toward global recognition. Yet in early February 2026, that narrative began to fracture under renewed scrutiny. According to multiple media reports, royal monitoring teams flagged inconsistencies between previously published biographies and newly resurfaced claims regarding Meghan's personal life during her Canadian residency. These discrepancies did not originate from a single source, but rather from a convergence of events: an off-camera audio leak, a series of social media posts, and the re-emergence of individuals connected to her pre-royal past. Central to this renewed attention is Chef Corey Vitiello, publicly known as Meghan's partner during much of her Toronto stay. While their relationship had never been denied, its duration, depth, and ending are now being re-examined in light of newer allegations. Reports describe shared residency, intertwined professional networks, and a sudden separation in mid-2015 details that contrast with earlier public timelines suggesting a longer period of independence before Meghan met Prince Harry in 2016. The situation escalated when a Toronto-based investigative podcast released an episode featuring anonymized testimony attributed to a former long-term partner. Though the speaker was not formally identified, listeners and analysts quickly linked the account to Vitiello based on specific references to locations, dates, and private conversations already present in public records. The podcast stopped short of confirming any illegal activity, but it raised questions about whether aspects of Meghan's personal history had been selectively presented during later royal vetting processes. Compounding the issue were rumors of a sealed marriage record in the United States, allegedly dating back to 2011. No court has publicly confirmed the authenticity of such a document, and Meghan's representatives have described these claims as speculative and defamatory. However, the persistence of the allegation, particularly when echoed across multiple platforms, has intensified pressure on institutions connected to her past and present. What transformed online speculation into a matter of institutional concern was not the rumor itself, but its implications. Legal experts, interviewed by British and Canadian outlets, emphasized that if any prior legal marriage had existed and was knowingly undisclosed during royal entry procedures, it could constitute a procedural breach, regardless of intent. This distinction between moral judgment and administrative compliance has shaped much of the current debate. Within Buckingham Palace, officials have neither confirmed nor denied specific allegations. Instead, they have framed their response as a matter of due diligence. Internal reviews, according to palace-adjacent sources, are focused on documentation, disclosure standards, and whether any material omissions occurred during formal background checks prior to the 2018 wedding. Meanwhile, public reaction has remained deeply divided. Supporters argue that the scrutiny reflects a disproportionate fixation on a woman's past relationships, amplified by media hostility and confirmation bias. Critics counter that transparency is essential when personal history intersects with constitutional institutions, and that selective storytelling, if proven, undermines trust. Notably, Meghan herself has remained largely silent beyond brief legal statements rejecting the allegations. Analysts suggest this restraint may be strategic, aimed at avoiding further escalation, while investigations, formal or informal, continue behind closed doors. Others interpret the silence as damaging in an environment where absence of clarification is often read as evasion. As February progressed, what once appeared to be a contained media flare-up evolved into a broader reckoning over narrative control, historical accuracy, and institutional accountability. The Canadian years, once seen as a neutral prelude to royal life, have become a focal point in a much larger question: where does personal privacy end when public trust begins? In the next phase of this unfolding story, attention shifts away from the past itself and toward the consequences of how that past is managed legally, commercially, and symbolically by all parties involved. As scrutiny intensified, the response from Meghan Markle's camp shifted rapidly from denial to containment. What emerged in early February 2026 was not a single rebuttal, but a coordinated counteroffensive spanning legal pressure, media positioning, and brand recalibration. According to individuals familiar with crisis response playbooks, the strategy appeared designed to slow momentum rather than reverse opinion. The first layer was legal signaling. Law firms linked to Meghan's representation reportedly issued pre-litigation notices to several media outlets, podcasts, and digital platforms. These communications did not allege proven falsehoods. Instead, they emphasized potential liability arising from unauthorized insinuation, voice attribution without consent, and speculative linkage to private records. The objective, analysts suggest, was to introduce risk calculations for publishers operating near the edge of defamation law. At the same time, Takedown requests were filed across social platforms, targeting posts that connected her name to alleged sealed records or implied misrepresentation during royal vetting. Many requests were denied under public interest and commentary exemptions, but the volume itself signaled intent to flood moderation systems, slow virality, and fragment the conversation. Parallel to legal pressure ran a more subtle media effort. Multiple opinion pieces appeared within a 4-8-hour window across US and Canadian gossip columns, each advancing similar themes: disgruntled ex-partners, opportunistic storytelling, and the unreliability of memory when filtered through resentment. The repetition of language and framing led independent watchdogs to speculate about centralized pitching rather than organic commentary. This approach aligns with a common crisis tactic: discredit the messenger to weaken the message. Rather than disputing every claim, the strategy reframes the debate as character conflict, he said. She said, thereby lowering the evidentiary standard in the public mind. In an environment saturated with information, ambiguity can be as effective as refutation. Another front involved recontextualizing the Canadian years. Sources describe internal briefing notes that encouraged a career-only narrative, minimizing personal associations and emphasizing professional discipline. Former colleagues were approached for supportive quotes highlighting focus, ambition, and independence. The intent was not to erase relationships outright, but to reduce their perceived relevance to later institutional processes. Concurrently, brand architecture was reassessed. Trademark filings for a new lifestyle platform were expedited, signaling a possible pivot away from identities entangled with royal affiliation. Branding experts note that such moves serve two purposes. They create distance from controversy while offering partners a narrative of renewal. However, accelerated rebranding during a crisis can also be read as evasion, particularly when legacy questions remain unresolved. What complicated the counteroffensive was timing. Legal and PR maneuvers unfolded as new voices entered the conversation: former partners, past associates, and commentators with proximity to royal procedures. Each new entry increased the cost of containment. In crisis management, momentum favors the side introducing information, not the one responding to it. Institutionally, the reaction was measured. Officials did not engage publicly with legal threats or media spin. Instead, they reportedly focused on documentation, timelines, and disclosure standards. This asymmetry, public noise versus private process, created an imbalance. While one side fought in headlines, the other worked in files. Analysts observe that this divergence often proves decisive. Courts of opinion can be influenced, administrative reviews cannot. Legal intimidation may slow publishers, but it does not alter records. PR reframing can shift sentiment, but it cannot amend submitted disclosures retroactively. By mid-February, the counteroffensive had achieved limited success in fragmenting the narrative, but failed to restore control. The story persisted, not because of a single allegation, but because of cumulative doubt. Each attempt to suppress or redirect attention became part of the story itself. In such scenarios, silence can be strategic, but only if institutions also remain silent. When one side speaks loudly and the other prepares quietly, outcomes are determined not by volume, but by procedure. The next phase of the crisis would move beyond messaging altogether. Commercial partners, regulators, and constitutional advisors, actors indifferent to narrative framing, began making decisions based on risk exposure rather than reputational loyalty. And in that arena, neither legal warnings nor public sympathy carry much weight. While public debate remained fixed on narrative control and legal positioning, a quieter but more consequential shift was taking place in commercial circles. By mid-February 2026, multiple industry sources described what they termed a confidence pause across sectors previously associated with Meghan Markle's brand media, lifestyle partnerships, speaking engagements, and long-term licensing. The change was not marked by contract cancellations or public statements. Instead, it appeared through delayed responses, extended review periods, and conditional language in negotiations. In corporate environments, this pattern is widely recognized as a risk containment response. Deals do not collapse loudly, they stall. Several agencies confirmed that exploratory talks scheduled for late January were pushed to Q2, pending internal reassessment. Others shifted from revenue share models to fixed, performance-contingent structures, transferring downside risk away from the partner. In at least 2 cases, memoranda of understanding reportedly expired without renewal. A procedural issue. Financial analysts point out that such behavior is not punitive, it is protective. Brands and investors are trained to evaluate not just market reach, but volatility exposure. When a public figure's profile begins to require constant contextualization, legal footnotes, reputational disclaimers, crisis clauses, the cost of association rises sharply. One senior branding consultant summarized the issue bluntly. It's not about controversy, it's about predictability. If every activation risks becoming a headline for reasons unrelated to the product, the ROI calculus changes. Streaming and media development discussions followed a similar trajectory. Concepts that once advanced quickly through pitch stages reportedly entered prolonged development holds. Requests for additional due diligence increased. Background checks expanded beyond standard practice, encompassing not just financial disclosures, but historical affiliations and prior contractual disputes. This escalation reflects a broader industry trend. Since 2024, entertainment financiers have grown more sensitive to reputational spillover, particularly after high-profile projects were derailed by off-screen controversies. As a result, greenlight committees now weigh narrative stability alongside creative potential. Merchandising and lifestyle ventures were affected differently. Rather than halting talks, some partners proposed structural separation branding that minimized personal attribution, or product lines fronted by third-party ambassadors. Such proposals suggest a desire to preserve market opportunity while insulating the core brand from individual risk. However, insiders note that these adjustments often signal diminished confidence. When a name becomes optional rather than central, leverage shifts. Royal affiliation, once a multiplier, had already been diluted. What remained was personal brand equity, now under reassessment. Financial pressure did not manifest as immediate loss, but as constraint. Revenue streams became less diversified. Advances shrank. Payment schedules extended. In private equity terms, liquidity did not vanish. Flexibility did. And flexibility is what allows high-profile figures to absorb shocks without altering lifestyle or strategy. Observers emphasize that none of these moves imply legal guilt or formal sanction. They represent market behavior under uncertainty. Capital seeks environments where downside is bounded and explanations are unnecessary. When uncertainty expands, capital waits. This waiting had a compounding effect. As major partners slowed, smaller collaborators followed suit, often citing alignment concerns rather than explicit risk. Momentum, an intangible but critical asset, began to dissipate. Projects that rely on sequential commitments stalled when early adopters hesitated. The contrast with earlier phases was stark. In 2021-2023, association carried aspirational value. By 2026, association required justification. That inversion altered negotiation dynamics across the board. Notably, none of this required coordination. Commercial ecosystems are networked but decentralized. When multiple actors independently reach similar conclusions, outcomes appear synchronized even without communication. This is how market consensus forms quietly, incrementally, and decisively. The commercial landscape had not collapsed, but it had tightened. Options narrowed, timelines stretched, the margin for error shrank. In such conditions, strategic patience becomes essential, yet patience is difficult to maintain amid ongoing scrutiny. The next question, according to industry analysts, was not whether opportunities still existed, but whether they could be pursued without exacerbating the very instability partners sought to avoid. At that point, commercial considerations began to intersect with personal ones, setting the stage for pressures that extended beyond boardrooms. What followed was not the explosive retaliation many observers expected. There were no emergency press conferences, no emotional rebuttals, no dramatic statements leaked to friendly journalists. Instead, the palace chose something far more devastating: restraint. Within constitutional circles, this response was immediately recognized as deliberate. Silence, in royal terms, is never absent. It is pressure. Senior aides described the strategy as containment through credibility. Rather than directly engaging with allegations or narratives circulating online, the institution quietly began reinforcing its legal and moral perimeter. Titles were not publicly stripped, but usage guidelines were reinterpreted. Invitations did not vanish overnight. They simply never arrived. Access was not revoked in a headline, it was eroded through protocol. Behind the scenes, a comprehensive internal review was initiated, examining every commercial contract, public appearance, and third-party agreement associated with the Sussex brand since their departure from royal duties. The focus was narrow but consequential, whether any activity had crossed the boundary between private enterprise and implied royal endorsement. One constitutional lawyer involved in the process described it bluntly: "This is not about punishment, it's about separation. The Crown is reasserting the line between who represents the monarchy and who no longer does." The most sensitive dimension of this review involved the children. Palace sources stressed that Archie and Lilibet were not under scrutiny as individuals, but as symbols. Their names, images, and implied status had become central to media strategies and commercial narratives far beyond the United Kingdom. That reality forced the institution into uncomfortable territory, protecting minors while disentangling them from brand exploitation. By late winter, new internal directives were issued. Any commercial use of royal titles, line of succession references, or symbolic imagery connected to minors would be challenged not publicly, but legally, quietly, methodically. The effect was immediate. Streaming platforms grew cautious. Publishing houses requested revisions. Legal teams began inserting clauses where none had existed before. The momentum of monetization slowed not because of scandal, but because of uncertainty. And uncertainty is poison in commercial storytelling. Meanwhile, within the royal family itself, a subtle recalibration was underway. Prince William, increasingly visible in matters of institutional integrity, emerged as a stabilizing force. His approach contrasted sharply with past eras of emotional damage control. There was no visible anger, no public condemnation, only structure. Observers noted a pattern: appearances emphasizing continuity, speeches focused on duty, and symbolic gestures reinforcing the monarchy's role as an enduring institution rather than a personality-driven enterprise. "The message is simple," said one former court correspondent. "This family does not chase narratives, it outlasts them." Perhaps the most telling signal came not from what was said, but from what was omitted. In annual briefings, in official biographies, and even in casual references, certain names began to disappear. Not erased, but deprioritized. The monarchy, after all, does not need to deny relevance. It merely reallocates it. For the public, this created a strange inversion. The louder the external narratives became, the quieter the institution responded. And in that contrast, credibility shifted. Because in the modern media age, where outrage is constant and disclosure is currency, silence backed by structure carries a unique authority. And that, insiders suggest, was always the plan. As the immediate turbulence began to settle, a deeper question emerged, one that extended beyond personalities, contracts, or headlines. What happens when modern celebrity logic collides with an institution designed to operate on centuries, not cycles? The answer, increasingly, appeared to favor time. For the monarchy, this episode reinforced a core doctrine: relevance is not maintained through reaction, but through endurance. Institutions that survive revolutions, wars, abdications, and scandals do so not by winning arguments, but by outlasting them. In this framework, controversy is not confronted head-on. It is absorbed, contextualized, and eventually neutralized by continuity. What many observers initially interpreted as passivity was, in retrospect, strategic inertia. By refusing to escalate, the Crown limited the lifespan of external narratives. Without direct engagement, accusations could not evolve into institutional conflict. They remained media events finite, cyclical, and ultimately replaceable. For the individuals at the center of the storm, however, the calculus was different. Personal brands depend on momentum. They require constant validation, audience engagement, and narrative renewal. When scrutiny intensifies without corresponding access or endorsement, maintaining that momentum becomes exponentially harder. Every move invites reinterpretation. Every silence appears tactical rather than organic. This asymmetry proved decisive. By early spring, analysts noted a divergence. While the monarchy's approval metrics stabilized, public sentiment surrounding associated commercial figures became increasingly polarized. Support remained strong within specific audiences, but broader appeal softened. Neutrality, a crucial ingredient for mass-market success, became elusive. The children, once framed as bridges between worlds, now stood at the center of unresolved tension. Their future role, royal, private, or something in between, remained undefined. And in that ambiguity lay the greatest risk, not of scandal, but of prolonged limbo. Legal experts emphasized that the institution's primary concern moving forward would not be punishment or precedent, but insulation. Ensuring that future generations are shielded from reputational volatility has become a priority across European monarchies, not just Britain's. The Sussex episode, in this sense, is being studied less as a family dispute and more as a case study in boundary failure. There are lessons here for public figures, for institutions, and for an audience increasingly fluent in media literacy. Transparency, while powerful, is not neutral. It reshapes incentives. It rewards immediacy over patience, emotion over structure. Institutions that adapt too quickly risk dissolving their authority. Those that adapt too slowly risk irrelevance. The Crown's response suggests it believes it has found a narrow path between the two. Whether history agrees remains to be seen. What is clear is that the center of gravity has shifted. The monarchy has reasserted itself not through dominance, but through detachment. It has drawn a line not with force, but with time. And time, unlike narrative, does not argue. It accumulates. In the years ahead, this period will likely be remembered not for any single allegation or revelation, but for the recalibration it forced. A reminder that institutions endure not because they are flawless, but because they are patient. And that in conflicts between